We're back in Camera Raw and we're going to move on to this next tab, which is the Tone Curve tab. The Tone Curve does similar things to what we did with these exposure sliders. So I'm actually going to reset these sliders to default. With the Tone Curve, it's basically editing the same thing, but with this graph. You can click right on this graph and drag up and down to edit parts of your image. On the left, you have your darks. On the right, you have your brighter parts. In the parametric option, you actually have to use these sliders down here. So you can just slide down the highlights. You can slide down the darks. You can slide down the shadows. Typically, when you edit a photo, you're looking for an S-curve. You've probably heard this. An S-curve is really a contrasted curve. And you can kind of see, I'll just do it really dramatically, but you see the shape of an S right here. And that's what an S-curve is. And the S-curve is really adding contrast to your image. I'm just going to reset all of these by double clicking them and then go to the point option. Now the point option is where we can literally just click right here and add an S-curve or change things right by clicking on the line itself. You can also change the channel of what you're editing. Right now we're editing the RGB channel, which is all of the colors of this image. If we want to edit just the reds, we can bring up the red channel and bring up the reds or drop down the red with clicking on this graph again. So if we bring down, if we brought up the red graph and we bring down the reds, you just see a lot of greens and blues. So if we go to green and blue again and we drop down the greens, then it's really blue. And maybe if we want to just make it completely blue, we can just bring up the blue then. So that's one way to have fun with your images and come up with some different styles. So I'm going to go back to the original and just by selecting in the curve menu, going back to linear. So I'll add a little bit of contrast just right here, just so that it looks a little bit good, a little bit more contrasty. Then I'll go back to my exposure, my basic adjustments, and drop down the highlights just a bit to get a little bit closer to where we were before. Drop down my whites and my blacks a little bit too. The next tab after the tone tab is the detail tab. There is sharpening and noise reduction. If you zoom into a photo a lot, now this photo was actually shot during the day at a low ISO on your camera. When you're shooting at night or shooting with a very high ISO, you get a lot of noise. It's like digital grain, and you can kind of see it right here, and you'll probably see it better on your computer if you open up this image. You can use, I'm skipping over sharpening for a second, but you can use this noise reduction option to decrease that noise. So if I bring this up, the luminance, you can see this noise kind of disappear. Everything gets a little bit kind of washed out and blurry, but when you zoom out, it actually looks really good. So to decrease noise, just go to the Details tab, go to Luminance, and drag up the luminance. The detail, contrast, color detail, smoothness, these are all things that adjust how the actual noise reduction works. But I tend to just leave those how they are for most photos because it looks really good just with the luminance. Sharpening is another thing you can do. So let's zoom in here to Isabel's mouth. This photo was shot kind of far away from both me and Isabel. Things start to get a little bit blurry. Edges are a little bit soft. The details aren't as crisp. So I'm going to get rid of the noise reduction first because that also makes things a little bit blurry. But with sharpening, we can actually increase the sharpness to make the edges of things a little bit more defined. You can play with the detail and the radius, which also adjusts how the edge of things become more sharpened. With a higher radius versus a lower radius, the higher radius you can really see how it's trying to sharpen things. You see the little, it's adding a little bit of grain to make things look a little bit more sharp. The next tab is the HSL grayscale tab. What this is hue, saturation, and luminance. All of these sliders edit different parts of these images. With hue, You have your reds, oranges, yellows, all these sliders, and this will change the hue of this specific color in this image. So say we take this green and we change the hue of the green, it's changing how the color of these leaves are. These leaves and the background are kind of yellow, so I'm going to use this yellow slider, and this can really show you what it does. Dragging it to the right, it becomes more green, more bluish aqua. Going to the left, it makes it more red. The same idea goes for saturation. If we want to drop all of the saturation of all of the greens, we can take this greens and the yellows, and we can drop the saturation, and it just leaves specific color. We could do the opposite and say we want to get rid of all color except for those greens. So we can drop the reds, we can kind of drop the yellows. There is a lot of yellow in those greens, so we don't want to drop it too much. Drop all of these. There's not really much purple or magenta in this image, but that leaves just one color. So that's a cool effect that you might want to do with some of your photos, just to single out a specific color that you want to have saturated. And then luminance, this is really cool. This adjusts the exposure of a specific color. So say we want to bring up the exposure of just the greens. We can do that. It's hard to see, but if I drop it to the left, all the way to the right, you can see it brings up the color of these greens. Same with the yellows. That really affects it a lot. This is a very creative way to edit just specific aspects of your photos. If we check this convert to grayscale image, it automatically makes everything black and white. The next tab is split toning. This allows you to edit the highlights and the shadows differently. So say we want to make the saturation of the highlights a lot more saturated and leave the saturation of the shadows, then we can just raise the saturation of the highlights up here. If we do both, then everything is more saturated. This really works well with using this hue option too. When you have the saturation slider to the right and you change the hue, it changes the hue of just that part of the image, so just the darks. And you can kind of create some really cool looks with this. I don't use this a lot, so I'm not going to go into it too much depth, but you should play around with it just to see what it looks like. Now lens corrections. This is the next tab. Whenever you shoot with a lens, with most lenses, there is a little bit of distortion. It's not how your eye sees reality. There will be a little bit of a warp around the edges. So if I check that, you can see what happens. It makes this look like it's actually bulging, but it's not really bulging. It's just flattening it out. Before it was a little bit warped. And then the edges get a little bit brighter because a lot of lenses have sort of a vignette look. It darkens around the edges, especially with wide lenses. Most cameras are very smart nowadays, and the camera model, the maker, and the lens you're using is baked into the photo, every photo that you take. And so when you bring it into Photoshop, it knows exactly what lens you're using. But if you're using a different lens and it doesn't know, you can choose the make, model, and profile of your lens with these options right here. If you want to customize it, you can change the distortion right here. See how it bulges and gets rid of that bulge, or the vignetting. You can make it darker or brighter. So those are custom ways to do it. So these are custom sliders for affecting the lens itself. I'm going to jump right into the effects tab. So the effects tab are adding some different effects to your images. If you're shooting a photo of a hazy landscape, this dehaze slider will try to clarify and make the details come out of what is in the haze. With the grain, you can add grain if you want. If you want to have that kind of style, you can change the size of the grain, the roughness, meaning the differentiation of the different grain there is. And then last, we have our vignetting, and this is post-crop vignetting, meaning if we crop this photo, the vignette will still be there. So let me just add a vignette. If I go all the way to the left, if we crop this image then to this inner part right here, say, the vignette would still be on this inner part. So the vignette is not attached to the full image. It will adjust wherever we crop the photo. So dragging to the left or right will create a darker or lighter vignette. Midpoint will make the roundness or the size of the vignette bigger or smaller. So if I drag this all the way to the left, you can kind of see more what's happening. So smaller or bigger. Roundness is exactly that, more circular or more square. So if I make the roundness all the way to the left and the midpoint all the way to the left, you get this more square vignette. Then feathering is how much does the vignette feather. All the way to the left, it's a hard line. All the way to the right is the most feathering you'll get. And then let me just change this roundness back to something in the middle, something like this. The feather a little bit less. With highlights, what this highlight slider does is it allows highlights of the image to shine through. So if I drag it all the way to the right, you can see Isabel's arm, Isabel's dress. The highlights of the image are shining through, whereas the darker parts of the image don't shine through anymore. And that's just a stylistic choice if you want the highlights to show. Sometimes a vignette, it just looks weird. You can tell that it's unnatural. Vignettes come naturally with different lenses, and they're also there to help you focus the viewer's eye on whatever's in the center of that vignette. But sometimes it can just look unnatural, and maybe allowing the highlights to shine through can help with that. The next tab is camera calibration. Just leave it at Adobe Standard. This next tab is presets. So if you want to save this, all the edits that we've done to this photo as a preset so that you can copy it and use it later on, you can click this new button and call this whatever preset you want, preset 1. You can choose which settings you want to save. So say we don't want the sharpening or the vignetting to be part of this, we can uncheck those options. We'll uncheck the split toning, the transform, lens vignetting, and we'll just leave the basic edits as part of the preset, and we'll just click OK. Then now, if we go and open up another photo, we can just go to the presets tab and click on the preset, and it will add and apply that preset, all those edits you made to that other photo. So say I open up this next photo and we go to our presets, we can just click that preset and it edits it. Since both of these photos were shot at the same place and at the same time, we can choose that preset and quickly edit multiple photos that way. Those are all the tabs I'm going to go over right now. In the next lesson, I'll just go over some of the very important options right up here.